The topic for the notes today is the organization of the judicial branch, taking a look at a couple different ways that courts and the judicial system in the United States is organized. The first of those is inside of an actual courtroom, right? There's a certain organization and a certain structure to it. So I'm going to point out some of the key players that you should be familiar with and the roles they play in a trial, because this is sort of the basis of how we try to pursue justice in America, is inside of a courtroom. Starting off right here, you have the prosecutor. This would be, in a criminal trial, a lawyer for the government who is trying to convince the jury that the defendant is guilty, that they have broken a crime, and that they deserve to be punished. In a civil trial, if somebody is suing someone else, then this lawyer and this person, this is not called the prosecution, but called the plaintiff. Okay, so what you would call this person depends on whether it's a criminal trial, someone's accused of breaking the law. In that case, this lawyer, this side would be the prosecution. If it's a civil trial where someone is suing someone else, then this side is called the plaintiff. On the other side, you have the defendant. The defendant is the person who is accused of committing a crime or is the person who is being sued. Here in this diagram, you have the defense attorney. Right? This would be the lawyer for the defendant. Right? As shown in the diagram, the defense attorney here is questioning the witness on the stand. His or her job is going to be to try to argue on behalf of the defendant that they either didn't commit the crime or that they're not responsible for whatever it is they're being sued for. Obviously, the central figure here is up on the bench is the judge. Right? The judge is in charge of presiding over the trial and clarifying any questions about the law. The judge is pretty much charged with ensuring that the trial is fair and follows the laws. On the stand, you have a witness, right? So here a witness is testifying in the trial. The witness will be questioned by the lawyers for both sides about whatever the case is about, whether it's about a crime or whether it's someone suing someone else. Witnesses play an important role in sharing what they saw, what they heard, what they know about what happened. They help to bring important viewpoints and important evidence into the case. And then, of course, over on the side here, you have the jury. The jury is a critical role. Not every case has a jury. Sometimes they're just decided by the judge, but a lot of cases do have juries. And the jury is made up of what are called peers, right? Just average American citizens who are brought in to listen to the lawyers from both sides argue the case, to listen to the witnesses, to weigh the evidence, and to decide whether the defendant is guilty, if it's a criminal trial, or to decide whether the defendant is liable for damages if it is a civil trial, right? Do they owe money to the plaintiff? In the United States, we have a dual court system. So this is a kind of a second way that our judicial branch is organized. We have a dual court system, right? Dual means two. So we have state courts and we have federal courts, right? And they sort of operate alongside of one another. Most cases are heard by state courts. State courts address things like traffic violations. Somebody got a speeding ticket, they have to go to a court. That's going to be a state court. Family law. So things like custody battles or divorce, those are going to go to state courts. Issues concerning state laws. If the law in question is a state law, it's going to go into the state court side of our dual court system. Then on the other side, you have federal courts. And federal courts are going to address disputes between states. Let's say Virginia and Maryland have a disagreement over an issue. That's going to be in the federal courts. Disputes involving national government programs. Let's say, for example, a business sues the Environmental Protection Agency because the Environmental Protection Agency has put some restrictions on them or it has fined them and they don't think it's fair. That's the EPA is a national government program, so that dispute will go to a federal court because it involves the national government. And then obviously issues concerning national laws. Okay? State laws are covered in state courts, national laws are covered in federal courts. Important to note that some issues could be heard by both state and federal courts. For example, issues involving the Constitution. They could go into a state court. They could go into a federal court. Issues that involve both state and national laws, right? If a national law matches a state law, right, and somebody breaks that law, they could be tried in state court or they could be tried in national court, federal court. Civil rights issues could go into either court. Okay? So sometimes they overlap. Okay? But the diagram kind of gives you a good picture, right? That there's sort of two sides to the judicial branch, and they both meet up at the Supreme Court. Both state and federal courts sort of follow the same organization on their side of the dual court system. And this is kind of a simplification, but this is kind of what I want you to understand here, is that there are trial courts and there are appellate courts. Trial courts in each system, in the state system and in the federal system, are the lowest level of the courts. That's going to be where cases begin. Right? So if somebody is accused of breaking a law, they're going to go on trial in the trial court, the lowest level of court. And then that court is going to make a decision. They're either guilty or they're not guilty. Most of the time, the losing side is going to consider appealing the ruling. The losing side is going to feel like, hang on a minute, I didn't like that decision. I would like to appeal the ruling. And so when that happens, the case could go to an appellate court. Okay, so the losing side can appeal the ruling to an appellate court. A very small number of cases are actually granted an appeal. Okay, most of the time, whatever the decision is in the trial court stands. Okay, most appeals are not granted. And the job of the appellate court, the judges who are on these appeals courts, focus on, they're not going to hold the trial all over again and call the witnesses back and do all of that. What they're going to do instead is they're going to review over the decision of the lower court. They're going to look at what happened. They're going to look at the laws, and they're going to decide whether or not the lower court made a mistake in applying the law, what's called an error in law. Okay. So let's say someone is accused of stealing a car. They're arrested for stealing the car. They're going to go on trial in the trial court. Then they're found guilty. They appeal the ruling, and they say that the ruling was wrong. The appellate court is now going to take a look at that first trial and decide, was the law applied correctly? Was it applied fairly? And they can either uphold the ruling and say, nope, we looked at it, the law was applied fairly, the ruling stands. Or if they notice there was a mistake, maybe the police did something wrong, maybe the judge made a mistake in his or her ruling, they might overturn the lower court decision and say, actually, no, the lower court got it wrong. We're going to overturn that decision. The losing side in the appeals courts then has the option of appealing to the final court, the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court gets thousands of appeals every single year, and they only accept about 100 every year. So very, very few cases actually make it to the U.S. Supreme Court. There are 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is the court of last resort. You cannot appeal a case any farther than the U.S. Supreme Court. So if the Supreme Court takes your case, they're going to do the same thing that the appeals court does. They're going to look over the cases and they're going to look at the law and decide whether the law was applied fairly, whether the laws are constitutional or violated anyone's rights. And once they make their decision on the U.S. Supreme Court, it's final. Right? You cannot appeal it anymore.